the same equilibrium no matter who is taxed. Our third question: does the equilibrium or incidence of the tax depend on whether the tax is collected from producers or consumers? Surprisingly, in the supply and demand model, the equilibrium and the incidence of the tax are the same regardless of whether the government collects the tax from producers or from consumers. We've already seen that firms are able to pass on some or all of the tax collected from them to consumers. We now show that if the tax is collected from consumers, they can pass the producer's share back to the firms. Suppose the specific tax tau equals $1.05 on pork is collected from consumers rather than producers, because the government takes tau from each P that consumers spend. Producers receive only P minus tau. Thus, the demand curve, as seen by firms, shifts downward by $1.05 to capital D to capital D superscript S. In figure 2.13, figure 2.13, the effects of a specific tax and an ad valorem tax on consumers. Without a tax, the demand curve is capital D and the supply curve is capital S. A specific tax of tau equals $1.05 per kilogram collected from consumers shifts the demand curve to capital D superscript S, which is parallel to capital D. The new equilibrium is E sub 2 on the original demand curve capital D if instead an ad valorem tax of alpha equals 26.25% is imposed. The demand curve facing firms is capital D superscript A. The gap between capital D and capital D superscript A, the per unit tax, is larger at higher prices. The after-tax equilibrium is the same with both of these taxes. This figure 2.13, price per kilogram on the vertical axis, and capital Q, millions of pork per year on the horizontal axis. There's capital D demand curve and two different other demand curves, capital D superscript S and capital D superscript A. The intersection of capital D superscript 2 and capital S determines the after-tax equilibrium, where the equilibrium quantity is capital Q sub 2 and the price received by producers is P sub 2 minus tau. The price paid by consumers, P sub 2 on the original demand curve capital D at capital Q sub 2 is tau above the price received by producers. We place the after-tax equilibrium E sub 2 bullet on the market demand capital D in figure 2.13 to show that it is the same as the E sub 2 in figure 2.12. Comparing figure 2.13 to figure 2.12, we see that the after-tax equilibrium is the same regardless of whether the tax is imposed on consumers or producers. The price to consumers rises by the same amount, delta P equals 70 cents, and the incidence of the tax, delta P over delta tau equals 2/3, is the same. A specific tax, regardless of whether the tax is collected from consumers or producers, creates a wedge equal to the per unit tax of tau between the price consumers pay P and the price producers receive P minus tau. In short, regardless of whether firms or consumers pay the tax to the government, you can solve tax problems by shifting the supply curve, shifting the demand curve, or intersecting a wedge between the supply and demand curves. All three approaches give the same answer.